The moment I realized something was terribly wrong, I wasn't even looking at the ground. My eyes were fixed on the sky. For nearly 3 decades, every time I drove up the gravel lane to my property just outside the quiet town of Ashbrook, I could always see the afternoon clouds reflected across the peaceful pond beside my eastern fence before I even shut off the engine. But after returning from 4 weeks in northern Michigan helping my older brother recover from heart surgery, there was no reflection waiting for me. Instead, a wide stretch of black asphalt baked beneath the blazing July sun. I actually eased off the gas because I thought I had somehow turned onto the wrong road. Yet the old red barn still stood exactly where it always had. My crooked mailbox leaned at the same familiar angle. The giant white oak my late wife used to decorate with lanterns every 4th of July was still proudly rooted in its place. Everything around me looked exactly as I remembered, except for the one thing that mattered most. I stepped out of my truck, let my overnight bag fall onto the driveway, and stood frozen in disbelief. The pond had vanished. It hadn't dried up or been drained, it was simply gone. In its place sat a freshly paved parking lot lined with bright yellow spaces, concrete will stops, elegant streetlights, and a polished wooden sign that proudly announced additional resident parking. It looked as though it had existed for years, but I knew every inch of that land. Every willow tree they had torn out, every rock my grandchildren used to leap from into the water, every patch of cattails where ducks returned each spring. Someone hadn't just altered my property. They had erased a piece of my family's history. I slowly walked closer, still unable to believe what I was seeing, until another sign mounted to my fence caught my attention. It was printed on glossy paper inside a weatherproof display, almost as if they expected me to appreciate it. It read, "Former water hazard removed as part of the Willow Creek Community Safety Improvement Project." I actually laughed for a couple of seconds, not because anything about it was funny, but because my mind simply refused to accept what my eyes were telling me. Water hazard. That pond had existed long before the first house in Willow Creek was ever built. My father taught me how to cast a fishing line from that dock when I was only 12 years old. After I bought the property from him, I rebuilt the dock with my own hands, planted weeping willows along the shoreline, restocked the pond with trout every few years, and watched 3 generations of my family make memories beside that spring-fed water. Every birthday cookout, every quiet Sunday afternoon, every winter when the ice became thick enough for skating happened right there. My wife, Linda, used to smile and say that if heaven looked anything like Earth, she'd be sitting on that dock waiting for me with 2 fishing rods. She had been gone almost 8 years. Yet every evening I still wandered down there with a cup of coffee just to hear the frogs sing and watch the sunset ripple across the water. Now there wasn't even a single ripple left, only scorching pavement sending waves of heat into the air. After a few minutes, I noticed my neighbor Walter standing beside his mailbox across the road. He wore the expression people have when they know something terrible has happened but have no idea how to break the news. He slowly walked over, removed his cap, and let out a heavy sigh. "Ethan, I tried to reach you. What happened?" I asked, though deep down I already knew this wasn't going to be some simple misunderstanding. Walter rubbed the back of his neck before answering. "About 3 weeks after you left, the HOA brought in contractors. They arrived with excavators, dump trucks, the whole operation. Everyone around here kept saying there had to be a mistake because everybody knew that pond belonged to you. But the crew insisted they had permission from the subdivision board." "Permission from who?" I asked quietly. "From themselves, I guess," he replied with a slow shake of his head. "I even warned one of the supervisors he was tearing up private property. He just smiled and told me all the paperwork had already been taken care of." Those words stayed with me. The paperwork had already been taken care of. Whenever someone says that before laying a hand on something they don't own, it usually means the paperwork hasn't been handled at all. Walter then handed me a folder he had been keeping in his garage. Inside were photographs he had taken while I was gone. The first showed bulldozers dumping loads of dirt into my pond. The next captured excavators ripping apart my dock. Another showed workers cutting down every willow tree I had spent years growing. But the final photo stopped me in my tracks. It showed the old wooden bench Linda and I had built together for our 25th anniversary, tossed carelessly into a construction dumpster like it was nothing more than broken scrap wood. I didn't shout. I didn't throw a single thing. I didn't even swear. I remained standing there, slowly turning each photograph over in my hands, while an unexpected sense of calm settled inside me. Years ago, I learned that anger clouds judgment and causes costly mistakes. The people responsible for this were about to find out that I never made important decisions in the middle of rage. I made them only after I had carefully gone through every piece of paperwork. The rest of that afternoon was spent collecting every bit of evidence before I made a single phone call. Walter's photographs went into one folder. The notice fastened to my fence went into another. By the time the sun disappeared, I was sitting at my kitchen table with county maps spread across the entire surface. My father always believed that land remembered everything if you knew how to read its history. Every deed, every survey, and every easement held another piece of the truth. At that point, I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was searching for facts. The following morning, I drove to the county records office, where an elderly clerk named Mrs. Hensley recognized my family's name before I even introduced myself. She smiled warmly, disappeared into the archive room, and returned carrying a stack of oversized property plats tied together with an old faded blue ribbon. "Your father always kept excellent records," she said. "Let's see what we can find." For nearly 2 hours, we followed property lines with our fingertips until both of us suddenly noticed something important. The main entrance road into Willow Creek didn't actually belong to the subdivision. Nearly 20 years earlier, the developers had secured a private easement because the shortest path to the highway crossed a corner of my family's property. They had been granted permission to build and maintain the roadway, but ownership of the land underneath had never been transferred. My father had insisted that wording remain in the agreement before signing it, and after he passed away, every one of those rights became mine. Mrs. Hensley adjusted her glasses, looked directly at me, and quietly said, "Before you make your next move, you may want to speak with an attorney." That had already been my intention. By lunchtime, I was sitting across the desk from Daniel Mercer, a property lawyer I had trusted for years. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything. He carefully examined the photographs, studied the easement documents, leaned back in his chair, and stayed completely silent for nearly a full minute. Finally, he let out a long whistle. "Ethan, either someone made the biggest property mistake I've seen in 25 years, or they assumed you wouldn't push back. Can they really destroy a spring-fed pond on private land?" I asked. He slowly shook his head. "Not legally. If they approved construction outside the easement while damaging your improvements, they're standing on extremely thin legal ground." Then he tapped one paragraph with his pen. "This part is even more interesting. The easement required both sides to avoid interfering with one another's property rights. A serious violation by either party could become grounds for ending the agreement under state law if supported by a court or accepted by both sides." Daniel looked up and smiled for the first time that day. They probably thought they were simply creating more parking spaces. What they actually did was jeopardize the very agreement that allows everyone to drive into that neighborhood. I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind ever since I first saw the parking lot. "If that easement is terminated, what happens then?" He answered in the calmest voice imaginable. "They'll either have to secure another legal access route or negotiate a completely new agreement." I didn't celebrate the answer. I didn't laugh or smile. I simply nodded because I finally understood why my father had always believed paperwork carried far more power than shouting ever could. During the following several days, Daniel filed legal notices to protect my claims while I hired an environmental consultant to document everything that had been destroyed. The report identified the pond as a naturally spring-fed water feature that supported wildlife habitat and groundwater movement. Every willow tree, every section of dock, and every improvement I had built over the years was photographed, measured, and carefully recorded. We weren't creating an emotional story. We were building a case supported by evidence. About a week later, I sent the HOA board a formal demand letter requesting immediate discussions regarding the destruction of my private property and the future of the access easement. 3 days went by without any reply. On the 4th day, an envelope finally appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't an apology. and it certainly wasn't an invitation to resolve the situation. Instead, it was a letter from the HOA's attorney claiming the board believed the parking expansion had benefited the entire community and arguing that the area had supposedly been treated as common property for years. I read the letter twice before passing it across the desk to Daniel. He gave a quiet chuckle, folded it closed, and said, "Well, they just made our job a whole lot easier." From that moment on, the legal process began moving forward much faster. Temporary notices affecting the easement were officially recorded, and contractors authorized through the court process were scheduled to begin work. Early one bright Friday morning, before the sun had fully risen, several construction crews arrived at the subdivision entrance. Residents stepped outside with coffee mugs expecting an ordinary summer morning, only to discover heavy equipment lined up near the only road leading into the neighborhood. There were no shouting matches and no heated confrontations. Survey stakes marked the property exactly where decades-old records showed the boundaries belonged. Workers installed temporary fencing around the construction area, while traffic signs directed vehicles away from the active work zone. Confused homeowners lowered their windows and repeatedly asked what was going on. The foreman calmly gave the same answer every time. Access is temporarily limited while a private property matter is being resolved. Within the first hour, the line of waiting vehicles stretched farther than anyone expected. Parents called their employers to explain they would be late for work. Delivery trucks turned around before entering. Landscaping companies canceled scheduled jobs. Every conversation ended with the same question: why hadn't the HOA warned anyone? Around lunchtime, HOA President Graham Holloway marched up my driveway with two other board members close behind him. His face was already red with frustration before he even reached my porch. "You can't block access just because you're angry about a pond," he snapped. I looked at him quietly before replying. "I'm not angry because of a pond, Graham. I'm angry because your board decided my property belonged to you." He shoved a folder toward me across the porch. "This entire community depends on that road." I gently pushed the folder back in his direction. "Then maybe your board should have considered that before paving over land it never owned." For the first time since everything had started, Graham had no response. He simply stood there in complete silence while the distant sound of construction equipment filled the air. At that moment, I realized something important. Every decision they had made rested on one assumption: that I would quietly accept whatever they decided. They had never imagined the actual owner of the property would know every boundary line and every legal right connected to that land. By the second week of August, the pressure inside Willow Creek was no longer coming from me. It was coming from the homeowners themselves. Every morning another crowd gathered near the construction fencing. Some carried briefcases on their way to work, while others pulled coolers behind them as they walked toward the temporary shuttle service arranged by the county. As the legal dispute continued, parents had to wake up earlier just to get their children to school. Delivery companies began charging additional service fees because drivers were forced to unload packages near the highway instead of inside the neighborhood. Realtors quietly removed open house signs after showing ended with potential buyers asking the same uncomfortable question. "Wait, the neighborhood doesn't even control its own entrance?" News of the dispute spread much faster than anyone expected. Local newspapers began covering the court filings, and before long a regional television station aired a report explaining that the case centered on private property rights rather than a simple disagreement between neighbors. The broadcast briefly showed the photographs Walter had taken before the pond disappeared, children fishing from the dock and willow trees reflecting across the water, before cutting to fresh footage of the oversized parking lot that had replaced it. Almost overnight, public opinion shifted. People stopped asking why I was defending my land and started asking how the HOA board had ever approved such a project in the first place. Walter called me after attending one of the homeowners' meetings and started laughing before he even finished saying hello. "Ethan, you should have seen it. I've never watched grown adults tear into a board like that." According to him, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Residents demanded financial statements, engineering reports, permit records, meeting minutes, and copies of every legal opinion connected to the project. One woman stood up, pointed directly at Graham Holloway, and said, You told us this was an improvement project. You never told us the land belonged to someone else." Then another homeowner asked the one question nobody on the board seemed willing to answer. "Did anyone actually verify ownership before spending the community's money?" The room fell completely silent. Sometimes silence reveals more than the loudest argument ever could. A few days later, Daniel called with the update we had both been expecting. "They're finally ready to negotiate." We met in a downtown conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and aging legal files. Graham looked nothing like the confident man who had stormed onto my porch only weeks before. His tie was crooked. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and for the first time since this entire situation began, he sounded less like the confident president of an HOA and more like an exhausted neighbor carrying the frustration of an entire community. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "we'd like to reach a settlement before this goes any further." I folded my hands on the conference table and gave a slight nod. "I'm listening." Their attorney slid the first proposal across the table. They offered to remove every section of unnecessary pavement from my property, restore the pond, rebuild the dock, replace every tree they had destroyed, restock the water with fish, cover all of my legal expenses, and pay additional compensation for the damage. It was a substantial offer, one that probably would have satisfied most people. I carefully read every page without saying a single word. When I finally reached the end, Graham looked at me and quietly asked, "Well?" I closed the folder and gently pushed it back across the table. "You're offering to replace everything you destroyed," I replied. "That's the minimum I expected. What you still haven't explained is why you believed you had the right to destroy it in the first place." No one answered. The room became completely silent. After several long moments, Daniel broke the silence by placing another agreement in front of everyone. "If we're going to settle this," he said, "our client requires permanent protections." The revised agreement created an entirely new right-of-way arrangement that included annual compensation for continued roadway access across my property, mandatory insurance coverage, strict maintenance responsibilities, independent boundary surveys every few years, and language making it absolutely clear that no future HOA board could enter, alter, improve, or disturb any part of my land without my written permission. It also required the HOA to formally acknowledge that its previous construction project had exceeded its legal authority. Graham slowly read every page before lifting his eyes toward me. "This is going to cost us a lot of money," I answered as calmly as ever. "So did replacing 30 years of memories with asphalt." He lowered his head, released a long sigh, and picked up his pen. One after another, the remaining board members signed beside his signature. There were no dramatic speeches, no celebration, and no handshakes for photographers. Only the quiet sound of pens moving across paper as the people who had ignored property boundaries finally agreed to respect them. The following spring, the restoration work finally began. The unnecessary pavement covering my land was removed one section at a time. Heavy equipment carefully excavated the compacted ground until the natural spring slowly found its way back to the surface. The process wasn't immediate. Nature rarely works according to our schedule. But with each passing week, the basin gradually filled with water once again. Volunteers from a local conservation group even joined the effort, planting young willow trees along the shoreline. The day I released the first bucket of trout back into the pond, I stood there smiling far longer than I realized. It wasn't because everything had been restored exactly as it had once been. It never could be. Some memories simply cannot be rebuilt. It was because, for the first time in months, the place finally felt alive again. A few weeks later, my youngest granddaughter sat beside me on the rebuilt dock holding a fishing rod almost taller than she was. She watched gentle ripples spread across the pond before quietly asking, "Grandpa, was it really worth fighting this hard?" I looked across the water as the evening sunlight reflected from its surface exactly the way it had so many years before. "It was never only about the pond," I told her. "If people decide your property belongs to them simply because it's convenient, they'll keep making those decisions until someone reminds them exactly where the line is." She thought about my words for a moment, smiled, and nodded just as a trout gave a gentle tug on her fishing line. Looking back now, I don't believe anyone truly came away as a winner. The homeowners lost months of peace because of decisions they never approved. The HOA board lost the trust of the very people they were supposed to represent. And I lost a place filled with memories that could never be perfectly recreated. But if there was one lesson worth remembering, it's this. Respecting another person's property isn't only about following the law. It's about respecting the life, memories, and years of hard work they built there long before you ever arrived. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the settlement? Or would you have taken the case all the way to trial? And if you had lived in that neighborhood, would you have blamed the HOA board, the contractors, or everyone involved? Share your thoughts in the comments because situations like this rarely have simple answers. If you enjoyed this fictional story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys legal drama, property disputes, and stories that prove patience can be far more powerful than anger.